Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. My name is Andrea Beatriz Arango. I am the author of Ibeliz Explains It All and Something Like Home, and I will be your moderator today for the Poetry in Motion panel. Before we start, please go ahead and read our anti-harassment policy in the chat box. And don't forget to subscribe to the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival's YouTube channel. If you are a school, classroom, librarian, or educator joining us today, our school visit fund is back. That means you can enter to win a free visit from a Latinx author or illustrator for your classroom or library. You can find the link to the entry form for that in the chat box as well. Now, I am incredibly lucky to be here today with the talented Ari and Jasminne. Ari, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and the book that you'll be talking about today?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Andrea Tison. I come from the Beatriz people, which is one of the 8 tribes of Costa Rica. I'm also African descended as well, so I'm Afro-Indigenous. And I am talking about Saints of the Household today, which is the book that's partially in verse, but we'll be talking about it more. But Saints is about 2 teenage brothers who are navigating their healing journeys after growing up in an abusive household. And part of it is in verse, and then part of it is in prose. So we'll be talking about that today too.
Amazing. And Jasminne, what about you?
Hello. Yes, I'm Jasminne Mendez. I live in Houston, Texas. My family is originally from the Dominican Republic. I'm a military brat, so I grew up kind of everywhere. Finally stayed. I've been in Texas for over 20 plus years. And I will be talking about Aniana del Mar Jumps In, which is a middle grade novel in verse about a young Dominican American swimmer who gets diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis. She lives in Galveston, Texas. So Texas does play, sort of a role as a character in the book in some ways. And she really wants to be in the water. She wants to return to the water. She really wants to swim, but for a variety of reasons, including her diagnosis and her mom's past traumas, she struggles to get back to doing the thing that she loves. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about Aniana del Mar Jumps In today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. For anyone who's listening or watching, I have read both these novels. They're honestly some of my favorites in the Latinx Kidlit book space. So it's a real treat to be here today talking to you both. I highly recommend that anyone who is here go and buy a copy or request it from your library. Both books are already out. Does yours have a translation, Ari?
No, not yet. I'm trying to get them to do it.
But Aniana is available in Spanish as well if you are looking for Spanish language books. Now, I have a couple of questions prepared that I want to get through, and then we should have time for some audience questions as well. Does that sound good? We all ready?
Great.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm curious. I know both of you create stories using a variety of mediums. How did you originally become interested in poetry? And when did you first discover novels in verse?
Jasminne, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So I do. I work in a lot of genres, almost all of them. I think the only thing I haven't tackled is adult sort of literary fiction or adult prose fiction. I write memoir, poetry, creative nonfiction, hybrid works, plays, etc. But for me, poetry has always been my first love, my first entry point into writing. I was in middle school writing my teen angsty, like my life sucks poems in my, in my journal. I was introduced. And the first time that I actually saw an author or read anything by an author who looked like me, a Black author, a Latinx author, specifically Black though, was Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes in middle school. And so I was drawn to poetry because it was like, oh, there are people who look like me who write this way. I hadn't read any books by African-American writers. I hadn't been introduced to any other Black writers in any spaces, definitely not any Latinx writers at that point yet. And so seeing people who look like me writing in this form and writing in a way that felt very accessible, because like at that point up until I think Edgar Allan Poe was like the first poet that I was like, oh, give me some more Poe. And then I read Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes and I was like, they're good too. These are amazing, right? And so writing, poetry was just my entry point into writing in general. And I wrote all through college and then got into spoken word and the slam scene here in Houston. And so novels in verse happened because I read The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. And so then I was like, hooked with writing novels, like reading novels in verse. And I swore that I was not going to do it because I thought it's what people expected me to do. And I've always been like a rebel with very little cause. Just like, I don't want to do it if you want me to. I'm just not going to do it. And then Aniana, like, you know, came to me during the pandemic and all the hours that I was sitting at home watching Moana over and over and over with my toddler at the time. And so, you know, I was like, what would happen if there was a young middle grade girl who wanted to get back to the water, but she couldn't because she has a chronic illness? And what does that look like? And so it just kind of went from there.
I love hearing that, Jasmine. The Poet X was my entryway also into novels in verse. I don't know if she knows like how many of us she has inspired, but I feel like I hear people mention that book all the time.
Yeah. And it's because I was familiar with her poetry. Like I'd read, you know, Elizabeth's poetry before. And so I was like, let me check this out. And then I tried to devour every single novel in verse that existed ever.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was just listening to her on a podcast this morning. And she was talking about like her inspiration, you know, and it's so interesting that, right, like she's been such an inspiration to so many of us verse novelists too. Like she's her mentor in her own right. You know, for me, I think that I got interested in poetry. Well, I was a big journaler and fiction writer, kind of like since I was able to write, or even before I would dictate things, and my stepmom, who was a writer, would type them out for me. And then, you know, I think poetry really started like, I remember like writing a haiku in 5th grade and thinking it was like the best thing in the world, you know, like I'm so proud of it. Like that, like art that way, I drew art that went with it. So it's technically like a broadside, you know, whatever, that's the fancy term for it now. I didn't know that then, but, you know, but like even that, like, I didn't really get to like poetry being kind of a place where, like, I guess I was accessing more depth in my own life until I had read Nikki's Bronx Masquerade in middle school, which was later. So I think that was in 7th or 8th grade, which is about like a classroom of kids in the Bronx, and all of them kind of have different voices and poems that they share. It's such a brilliant book. And I feel so lucky that I was like in middle school and got to read that book. So that book, I think, really kind of cracked a door open for me, where I was able to kind of access parts of myself that I didn't in my journals, even because I could kind of coast around things, or, you know, in my fiction where I was in other worlds, or, you know, basing characters off of my friends, you know, I'm sure all of us did that kind of stuff, you know, that kind of thing. So it's really, I think poetry was really that space where all of a sudden, like, my kind of inner life and voice was able to be accessed. And I think that that's kind of the power of verse novels, is they kind of naturally bring out that vulnerability, I think. And so, it makes sense that, I don't know, for like, we're, you know, different books require different things. And I think sometimes those books that are kind of reaching those, like, I don't know, heavier spaces, those big questions, like emotional spaces, are often really met really well with verse. But novels in verse, so Bronx Masquerade for sure. House on Mango Street, which is kind of like hybrid form, right? Like it's like vignettes, but it's very poetic. That was another book. I was in graduate school for creative writing and writing for children and young adults when I read Long Way Down, and that book was really influential for me too. So I was really interested in verse and like any kind of hybridity. It always seemed to connect with me. And I think in ways that we don't always know why. So that which is kind of the cool mystery about verse, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I don't know if it was the same for you all, but like for me, I didn't realize that novels in verse could be a thing until I read my first one. Like I was like you, Ari, I had like my fiction was for very specific things, and then my poetry was very personal, and it had never occurred to me to combine them. So thank you to all the people who came before us and were writing those books that got us inspired. But I do want to talk a little bit about your books. So Saints of the Household and Aniana del Mar Jumps In have had a very good year. Congrats to both of you on your awards. I'm curious, when you first got the idea for your books, did you know off the bat that you wanted to use verse, or was that a decision you made later? Like, did you outline first? What was the process for determining if there was going to be verse and how?
Yeah, no, it was always going to be verse. I do not fancy myself a successful or competent prose writer for fiction. I mean, I'm sure I could. I know, again, I've learned not to say never, so I'm not going to say that I'll never do it. But no, for me, it was very intentional and very specific that it would be a novel in verse because of sort of the very I know what poetry can do on the page that some prose can't in some ways. I mean, I guess you could, right, play with white space and line breaks as a prose writer. I'm not going to, say that you can't do that, but I definitely felt like Aniana's story being so in the body and so much of her fight, not only being her conflict, not only being sort of with her mom and with society in some ways, but with her own body, her own internal like struggles and emotional, and trying to deal with the loss of the thing that she loves and who she was, dealing with the grief of the person that she knew as herself, changing so much. I really felt like you can do so much more with poetry and with on the page with that as well. I also had this wonderful fancy idea, because I know my students loved it when I was a teacher, to include concrete poems in this book. And so there's a lot of that, a lot of shapes in the book. And so I did that very intentionally. And so I felt like in verse was the way that you can really do that and really get into the physical space, the mental, emotional space of the character through what poetry can do. So it was, for me, it was always going to be a novel in verse. There was no option.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I think so. First Saints came out in Jay's point of view, which is in vignettes, but it was very like short vignettes. They were even shorter than what they are in the book now. In the first draft, when I like sat down and got going. And then, the book was like, it had its bones, but it felt like there was something missing. And Jay had this brother that he was close with. And then it just, it occurred to me that for this book to really be what it needed to be and thicken, it needed Max's voice. And Max is a painter. And so similarly, I felt like he needed to be in verse, because as I think about painters creating, so much of that is a visual aspect, like where you can see things on the page, and every poem in Saints has like there's an intention and a flow, which was kind of annoying for my editors, like, because right, like where sounds like tricky, right, with editors, because it's like, yep, no, it has to be here, mirrors things here, or the prose is in conversation here, or poetry is in conversation here, and also then and then also too with concrete poetry, right, like there's it was really fun to kind of bring Max's voice in and his artistic ways and the questions that he's asking and all of that, and then really to start having his poems turn into art. And so towards the end of the book, the pieces themselves start shaping like some of his art, his pieces of art that he would do on the canvas, which was really fun to do. So yeah, I think I didn't know I was going to be leaning into poetry at first. I knew that I was like doing something poetic with the vignettes, but it wasn't until kind of reading more verse novels and thinking about my character and trying to think about the form and the function of a book, right? Mm-hmm. We talk about that as writers a lot. Like, okay, if we have this form, like poetry, how do we have it like blend with what we're doing, right? With water or with, distance or conversation or disability, right? Like there's just so many different ways that poetry can be in conversation with different themes or topics. Mm-hmm. I think the more we think about that, like the richer the work gets. So for me, maybe it was a little easy because it's just a painter. So it's like, yes, poetry, that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I feel like that always, like, so thinking about who our characters are and what they're calling for often, kind of helps us to realize what the poetry is going to look like on the page too.
Very cool. I don't think I knew that about your book, that it started out with just the one POV.
Yes.
That sounds really hard to rewrite. So, I mean, as we talk about writing, obviously writing is hard, and so is editing and revising and polishing and all the things that we do. What are some unique challenges that you have found in working with novels in verse, and what has been really rewarding?
I think for me, what's been challenging with book 2, for some reason, like Aniana it just flowed a little bit easier. It just like came, it happened. I wrote it. It was like, oh, this thing just poured out of me. Obviously it needed a lot of work still, but like the original first draft was just kind of like it happened. And I don't know if it's because I was really steeped into reading a lot of novels in verse at the time. And so I kind of just had the structure and the plot and all of that figured out more or less. But I still cut a lot. And I think that for me, the challenge recently, in particular, with this other book that I've been working on, what was this idea of like what to keep and what to take out, right? In the sense that like you don't necessarily need like every single scene by scene moment, right? That's kind of the opposite of what you actually want in a novel in verse. You want these sort of snapshots and taking your reader from one place to the next. And so for me, it's kind of been like, well, at what points do I reveal information that's important rather than like front loading it, right? And then like going into the story, like what poems about my character's backstory or the setting can I put in moments where it makes sense rather than just like, here's her whole backstory, here's the origin of her name, here's her mom's story, here's her, and then let's get to the plot. But like at what point, right? And in a novel in verse, I think you're able to kind of like pluck a poem out that's not specific to the plot, that's more like a description or an internal monologue even, and figure out, does it go here or does it go there? And kind of playing with that. And that's something I could like play with for hours. And like, it just is like, wait, I just spent all these hours. Do I really need to do this? But that's where a good editor comes in and can kind of help you figure that out. But that was a real challenge for me because you kind of break away from that traditional sort of like plot expectation, if you will, of like every single moment in time has to be accounted for. You had a second part to that question, but I've lost it.
Well, what are the good parts?
The good parts. Oh, okay. It was like,
it seems like you really enjoy playing around with it for 3 hours.
Well, I do. I mean, and that's so it's a challenge, but it's also something I really, really love because I'm very much, I consider myself kind of like a collage artist when I'm writing a novel in verse, because I can physically, if I don't print out the pages, then I'll have the title, right, of like each poem or each section, and I'll lay it out and I'll see, can I move this here and what does that look like? And I get really like physical about it. So I really do. I love revising. But like the initial like motivation to revise, I'm like, what if that first read through of a draft is like treacherous because I'm like, what if it actually sucks? And you get kind of like, you worry, like, I don't want to read it, but then once I'm in it, I'm like, yes. And so, and I love just, like I mentioned, the concrete poems, playing on the page, playing with white space, playing with font sizes, and font types. I know you do that, Andrea, and Ibelis explains it all, just sort of that look of a journal. So I love being able to do that. And I think in the Kidlit world, our young readers are so much more, amenable to that. They're more like willing to just take that in and like explore a book and engage with a book in new and surprising ways. Like they want that. And so yeah, like I love being able to do that with verse.
I love how you connected what's hard with what's rewarding. That's fabulous. Like, oh my gosh, you answered so many of the difficult questions with joy, which I feel like it's always like an effort for me, especially as I'm in the second book. I think, for me, writing Saints, the difficult part was, and I think, especially since I teach folks too now and like young verse novelists that are working on their books, I notice that a lot of us who are more wired as poets, the plotting can be a little difficult because we're wired in more of a musical way. And so like a narrative arc or a story structure is not always something that a book comes with. Sometimes it does, but sometimes that part needs to be crafted. Mm-hmm. The cool part about like any book, right, is like it's magic and both not magic, or like that magic has a craft, right? Like we talk about magic, right, like as being this beautiful thing, but then also, right, like you need to go to magic school. Like you still need to like learn how to do the magic, right? Like you have to like get your craft down too, right? So like it's like this conversation of that. So for me, like I think like I had a plot absolutely insane starting, you know, with when I like sold it. But then it became clear like I needed a subplot. Like I needed more plot. Like one plot wasn't enough. And so then that was kind of an entrance into bringing in like widening the cast just a little. So often I think it can be like, again, how to speak to poets, right? Like rather than being like you need a subplot. It's like, well, what if you brought in another character? How is that going to complicate things? So often our subplots are in relationship to our secondary characters. So it's kind of like, you know, there's other ways we can kind of like bring those parts out of ourselves. But like, so for Saints, similarly, like Nicole didn't exist, who's one of the best, was the boy's cousin, was kind of like a key part of the book now. She didn't exist in the first iteration of it. But that was one of the revisions, was to bring in another character. And then, you know, that was difficult, but also I guess similarly too to Jasminne, it was rewarding because I can't imagine the book being without her anymore. She's sometimes people's like favorite character, which is like, I was like, oh, that's great. Like I had these boys first. I'm glad you love Nicole. I love her too. Like, but you know, it was you know, I think there's sometimes like that, that conversation of the things maybe we work really hard on are the things that are rewarding. And I have to tell myself that for my second book right now, because it's just been really, really hard. So maybe after all of this, it'll feel really, really rewarding, but I'm not there yet.
You'll get there. Cause listen, I was where you are like a couple months ago. For about a year, I was in the like trenches of book 2 and I wanted to like throw all the things.
Yes. There are many, but see how spare my house is on this side? I want to throw so many things and I won't throw my plant, but I'll throw this.
Honestly, like you have already made the session rewarding for me, Ari, with your whole like, oh, if we fail at plot, it's because we're poets. Because I've been working on this YA very plot heavy book for several years, and my agent just read the whole thing and sent me feedback, and she's like, maybe you should get some plotting books. And I was like, why am I getting told this now? But of course, it's because I'm not writing in these like disconnected poems anymore. And yeah, I'm gonna.
For real. Well, I mean, I decided to write a mystery for my second book. I'm like, what am I thinking? Like, I'm a poet. Like, this is like, but the book demands what it needs to. So again, like, I'm like trying to look at the long vision. Like, yes, there's a reason. Okay, like there's some spiritual hand upon this, but I don't see any of the fingerprints yet. Like, you know, like, so yeah, we do. We put ourselves, but we're also, that's how we grow too. Like I think it's helpful, like especially since we're talking to so many young people, right? Like we are still growing. Like the work is not, you know, you don't just finish a book and like you're like, yes, I'm done, I did it. You know, like I mean, some people do, but at the same time, we're all still growing. Like young writers that are coming in and starting their craft, hey, we had to do that too. Like, and we're still doing that. That kind of muscle and vigor that young people have. I miss how like rigorous I was when I was 14, you know, and writing. Like I miss that, and I have to welcome her back. Like, so I think like that kind of energy that, you know, we have when we're just starting is like so beautiful. And, you know, I think so sometimes when we have a book or a couple of books existing in the world, it's difficult to get that back, but it's also energizing to be around young people and seeing them do that work too. It just reminds us kind of our roots too.
I love that. Well, and I love this comment. I would love more mystery novels in verse, because that ties into my next question, actually. Thank you, Jean, or Jean. I don't know how you say your name, but thank you so much. My next question is, do you think poetry transcends genres and topics? And are some stories better suited to verse than others? You know, is there a reason why we see novels in verse mostly as like contemporary historical fiction versus mysteries or sci-fi or horror? I know, Jasminne, you talked about this a little bit earlier, like some stories are more emotional and like require verse, but can we still do verse in other genres? And what is a genre that you would love to attempt to be rigorous with, right? Maybe sometime in the future.
Yeah. No, I know that there are a few. I haven't read them myself, but I know that there are a few because I've taken like a couple of novel and verse like workshops and classes where I've been introduced to different books and stuff. And there are actually a couple of mystery, sci-fi, Black speculative fiction novels in verse. They exist. They're few and far as between. You kind of have to know the genre and kind of be in sort of specific book circles, I think, to really kind of know. But they do exist. I can't tell you any off the top of my head, only because a lot of genre fiction isn't like what I normally go to, but I do know that there are mystery novels in verse. I know there are sci-fi, fantasy novels in verse. I think the tricky part with some of those genres, though, is because of the expectation of like world building and setting up, and like there's so many plot elements related to what you need it for it to be like a true mystery or detective or sci-fi fantasy, right, situation, that sometimes I think maybe the verse novel, because, you know, in verse, typically this idea is this economy of language, right? The less words, the better, or that's the expectation, right? That what can you do with the few amount of words, right? With the sort of like that concision of language. But I know they exist. For me, I have been toying with a YA romance dual point of view in verse. I have characters. I have characters. I have character names. I have a general location. I have a setting. I believe the setting is also going to speak. So I'm sort of channeling Margarita Engel in that sense. Like, you know, she likes to have sort of animals and different things that non-human things speaking, right? Beings that have voices. And so that's something that I'm playing with. I have drafted a book proposal for a novel in verse that's historical fiction with magical realistic elements, magical realism, and things like that. So again, I have like a full concept for that book, but only a book proposal. I haven't fully drafted it yet. So those are two that are out of my comfort zone. I love reading historical fiction. I love reading books that contain elements of magical realism. I love reading YA, romances and rom-coms in general. I'm very much the woman who sits from like November to January watching all the rom-coms on all the channels, all the Christmas rom-coms. But I just, I've never attempted to write it. So I think that those would be fun challenges that hopefully maybe somebody would buy one day.
I mean, I've definitely seen a few like YA romances, like Lakin has some, but yeah, you're right. It's not the go-to for YA.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that, and I'd love to try it. So.
Oh, that's fabulous. I'm going to treat this question, because I saw it ahead of time, as a prompt, because I hadn't really thought about ways that I think, sometimes, I mean, like, for example, like I said, I'm working on a mystery, but it's more traditional prose. The point of view is kind of wonky. So that's like how I could like get some poetry in there, like, but the structure isn't verse. But I have been like, I really love, like, if I'm thinking about my obsessions, like, I always tell people, if you're like trying to come up with concepts for books or pitching, like, look at what you're obsessed with right now. So like, I have been obsessed with like ragtag groups of middle schoolers overcoming hard things, like, or high school. So like, I love the show Wednesday right now, for example. Like, I rewatched it. I love Stranger Things. I'm so excited for the third Witchlings book to come out in like 10 days. Like, I can't, like, I'm gonna eat that book up so fast. Like, oh my god, thank you. It's like, so, like, yeah, shout out to her book. So, it's just like I just have been eating that stuff up. It's my favorite. And so when I was thinking about like this as a prompt rather than like, what do I want to do today? I was like, oh, how could like the magic be like, how does, again, form and function? If I love this kind of like magical experience or like strange experience, right? How does that fit with prose? Well, spells, right? Spells or language or any kind of thing like that, right? There could be something really interesting playing with like the concept, like the genre of horror or magic, right? Like with verse, and those could be some interesting ways that those things could connect, I think. Claire Ball-Ortega, thank you. I was just so excited for the book. Oh my god. Yes. If you haven't read her series, shout out to her. Go read the Witchlight series.
No, I love that. I'm working on it. Well, I'm trying to sell a book right now that is a different genre. That, you know, if you've read my 2 books so far, or if you've read an arc of my book coming out in February, they're all very like introspective and kind of emotional journeys. But my next one is a kid who lives in Yellowstone Park. And it's like mixed. So he has chronic nightmares and all the dream sequences are in verse. And then the awake parts are in prose. So this is me preparing myself for the YA that I'm struggling with. Well, as you said, we're still growing as writers, right? And I think like trying new genres and trying new things is what keeps us getting better. So yeah, I love this. I love this for us. I want all of these books that you have talked about. So when we're talking about, you know, growing as writers, obviously we're still growing, but we've also already done a little bit of growing, you know, and we have some books out or in the works. So what is your best tip for young writers who are interested in telling stories, either fully in verse or playing with verse and prose? I know you all mentioned some of this in the beginning, but are there any books that you would recommend, you know, fiction or nonfiction, that helped you on this path to becoming a verse novelist?
I can start. I think my kind of big tip is to, you know, pay attention, kind of like what I said before, what you're obsessed with, and particularly with reading, because if you're interested in being a writer, pay attention to what books got you interested in being a writer or becoming a writer or a reader, you know? So I think like something about those books are calling parts of you out. And I think that is just like a really good muscle to have as a young writer, and you know, throughout your journey, is to pay attention to what you're reading and what's connecting with you and what makes you feel alive. And really not letting other people tell you what makes you alive. Because I think when I was young, like when I was in college and I was first shown like contemporary poetry, like for adults, I really loved like Lucille Clifton and like this, like her like simple compact poems. In fact, I just listened to like Won't You Celebrate With Me this morning. It's a beautiful poem about like being a woman of color in the world, and the world always trying to come against you and you having to make your own way. And I just was like bawling, right? Like I'm like, and I have that poem memorized. Like I, you know, because it's compact, it's little. I didn't even know I had it memorized until it was in an audiobook, and I was like saying the lines with her, like, because I was like, oh, I got, like, I know this from Lucille Clifton, and I've heard her, you know, I've played recordings of it over and over again for my students. And so anyway, so like I think about like something about Lucille Clifton's voice when I was in college, like connected with me. And I can't remember, I think I found like her on Poetry, like Poetry's website, like rather than like getting taught some of her work. And like I had like tried like at the time, like writing kind of like closer to her voice. And as like a prompt, I think, from one of the professors. And it's interesting because my professor was like, no, this isn't it. But it was interesting to me though, because they thought that my voice was like my professors in college thought my voice was the voice of my protagonist in my fiction, that I didn't show anybody because that fiction was like my sacred piece separate. And so I was very familiar with that voice. I'd spent years with that voice. So when I was writing a lot of poetry, it was coming out as that character, really. It wasn't really my voice. And it was interesting to me, like, cause so now as a teacher, when I think about this, I'm like, yeah, like you have to be careful where you say this isn't it, because now when I look at my poetry as a much more developed poet, it's a lot more, it's not nearly as good as Lucille Clifton. It's a lot more akin to her work though. It's more spare. It's more narrative. It's simple. It's so like I've had a young person come up to me and share that she memorized one of my poems from Saints. Like, you know, like they're just a different, you know, I don't have a lot of other poets memorized other than Joy Harjo and Lucille Clifton, and Gwendolyn Brooks. Like there's something about those poems that allow that kind of resonance and kind of continuance. But like, Anyway, so I feel like paying attention to the poets that you're obsessed with and really, or the writers that you're, and really paying attention to that and really not stifling your voice, letting yourself be obsessed and letting yourself write with them in mind. So yeah, that's what I would say. It's not specific book titles, but look at poets, pay attention to what you love, and really let that dictate what you're writing.
Yeah, I mean, I ditto to all of that. And then for me, again, it's not necessarily like, you know, you can sort of take craft books with a grain of salt and take and pick and choose things from them. And some things work and some don't. And some are really useful and some are not, and et cetera. So, but for me, the greatest teachers have always been the writers and the books themselves. And so really, which is just like, I mean, this is like a whole course, like the grad school level, but reading books like a writer and not necessarily like a reader, right? So there's books that I will read for the pure enjoyment of just reading it. I won't take a single note. I don't look at line lengths. I don't read for anything specific. I'm just in pure enjoyment, right? And then there are books that I specifically read because I'm like, I want to know what it looks like to write dual point of view, right? And so how did this writer do it? And so then I'm like taking notes while I'm reading that book, or I'm really analyzing like, you know, how long each line is, or how many stanzas or line breaks, or looking at, are they using, you know, I learned a lot about novels in verse and like the structure through Jason Reynolds and Kwame Alexander, just using the way that they use texts and fonts and white space and all of that, just taking notes and looking at that. So if you're interested in writing novels in verse or any genre, right? Like my opinion, I know not every author, every writer subscribes to this, but like devour that genre, right? And pay attention. What are the similarities, right? What are the writers who are successful, right? Like pick up those award winners. Hint, hint. Pick up those award winners and see what you can. All three of us are award winners here. See what you can learn from them, right? What is it that makes these books good, right? What is it that has brought these books to the level of attention, right? That they're getting, and sort of the recognition that they're getting. What are they doing with the words on the page, the language, the imagery? Aida Salazar is one of my favorite authors to Aida to study and to see how she crafts her novels in verse as well. And so I think that, yeah, your obsessions, what character types are you interested in? I will read almost anything that has a BIPOC female protagonist, because that's who I write for. That's my audience. So those are the books that I look for to read when I'm crafting my own books. I did write a book with a male protagonist. Let's hope I captured an 11-year-old boy's voice well. We're still waiting to hear back from my agent to see if we're going to green light that one to pass it on to my editor. But yeah, I had to read a lot of books with male protagonists, right? In order to feel like, okay, I need to get into this voice, into this headspace. Like, how do I do that? Like, I've never been an 11-year-old boy. I don't know what 11-year-old boy in 2017 likes, because that's what it's set. Like, are they playing Roblox? Are they playing Minecraft? I don't know, right? And so like I really had to kind of get into books that had those kinds of protagonists and with those different types of stories to really kind of get into that headspace and to find a way to craft and to write this book that I worked on recently. So I say, yeah, I mean, just like reading books in the genre that you want to write in is probably your best teacher. And just, yeah, going from there.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also add reading books outside of the genre that you're writing in. It's like Ari was saying earlier, like, oh yeah, I had these vignettes and they were really poetic. You know, like you can find poetic things in books that don't have poetry. I do all the time. And in genres that are not the genres that you're writing in, especially I think as like time passes, genres are getting very like mixed up, you know, and it's like hard to define sometimes like what box the book fits into. So I know it's helpful for me to see how other books are incorporating, like maybe it's not a horror, but it's got like horror elements, or it's not a mystery, but there's like suspense. So yeah, but second all of your advice. Well, we do have time for some audience questions. I don't know if we have any already. If we don't, drop those in the chat box. And here we go. From Julie, a student wants to know how you can make your book into a movie.
Good to see you, Julie. I recognize you.
Yeah, Julie.
Very present on TikTok, I think. Welcome to her class. Oh my gosh, turning it into a movie. That is a really good question. I think we all would like to crack that code because it wouldn't be that bad of a paycheck, from what I understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do have some friends that have had their books what you called optioned, where people like my friend Elliot Schrafer, for example, his book The Darkness Outside of Us was picked up by Page Boy Productions, and it's really exciting when that happens. Very rare, but it's really cool when at least we can celebrate our friends and stuff like that. But I think kind of something that I guess the back end of that is, how does that happen, right? Is that, a lot of us writers have agents, people that represent us between, we have our books that we create, and then we have agents that are kind of like this middle person that kind of, that advocates for us with our publishers, right? I just forgot which direction I was going. And so they kind of, they kind of negotiate for money and rights details, like rights meaning like, does the publisher get to publish it in Spanish, or do they have to buy it in Spanish from that author, right? Or can they buy it up front for a different cost, right? Like that kind of thing. There's all those kinds of questions. Or how much percentage of a book does an author get to make after the book's been out for a while, right? All these kinds of questions that writers perhaps we don't love trying to think about. So our agents do that work for us. Some agents get to submit books to the movie industry. They have relationships with people in the film industry, and they can kind of do that. Some authors have different agents just for movie rights and stuff like that too, which is really cool. So that's kind of how it happens. They pitch the book out to different people that create movies, and then if they're interested in them, then they might buy the rights to it, right?
And that's just one layer.
That's one layer. I know.
I mean, only because I see these random posts and threads, and I know that there's another, because someone had recently posted about, I've seen these books that came out 5-6 years ago, or like even 10 plus years ago, and they're just now being turned into movies. Like, why the delay? And honestly, like, again, movie industry is a whole other separate industry from the publishing industry even, right? And so there's lots of middle people to get to before a movie even gets on the screen. Like, before you even have like a casting and a director, like, you need to adapt the book into a screenplay. That's oftentimes not the writer themselves, but someone else, unless you kept those rights and said, no, I want to be the one that writes the screenplay, right? And then the screenplay has to get picked up by like a production company or a house or somebody. Then there has to be producers that want to really be willing to invest and give money to put on the movie. You have to find a director, actors, like, it's a whole sort of, and that's why, and that can take years. And even if you sold the rights, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll get turned into a film. Yeah. So not to discourage anyone, I highly, think it's possible.
I will say, Jasminne's book has been turned into a play. Well, so, she has had a visual adaptation, and you wrote the screenplay, right?
I helped adapt the book into a play. Right. Currently,
whatever the version.
That we're trying to.
You helped write the script.
Yes, I did help write the script for the play version, the musical version of Aniana jumps in, and we hired a composer, and I had a co-writer who also helped me adapt, and she wrote the songs. I wrote a lot of the dialogue. We combined our ideas, and so we have had a reading of the musical itself, and so now we're trying to make it into a full production, but it is also a process.
Love it. Congrats. That's
amazing. Thank you. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Poetry can be an intimidating genre. What advice do you have for someone that thinks they're terrible at poetry? Asking for a friend.
Oh man, I feel, this is my philosophy on life. Poetry, like yoga, is for everyone. And there is a specific kind of poetry and a specific kind of yoga for each and every body and each and every type of person. Just like Ari was mentioning, she really enjoys Lucille Clifton because there's the small, there's the short, there's the concision, there's the simplicity of language that actually can make you cry on a random Friday morning, right? Because it's just so emotional, right? And then you have sort of these longer epic poets, right? And that use imagery and all this language, right, and all these things. So I think that, and there's everything else in between, right, and beyond, and beyond all of that, right? There's surrealist poetry, there's contemporary, there's Shakespearean, there's sonnets, there's different forms, etc. And I think it's a matter of finding through trial and error, right? Like what kind of poet you are, what speaks to you, and again, following those voices or those obsessions, if you will, that you're drawn to. Who are the poets that you like reading? And is there a way that your voice is similar to that, or that mirrors that? Or what can you kind of beg, borrow, and steal from them, right? Is it short lines? Is it long lines? Is it the simplicity of the language, right? Someone I really adore is Juan Felipe Herrera, because I love him as a performance poet, as well as he's beautiful on the page and on the stage. And I don't know how he does it. I'm still trying to crack the code of how you are so brilliant, like how your poems on the page are just as amazing on the stage, because not everybody is transferable. Not everybody sort of has that ability to kind of be as fluid on stage and on the page. And so I think that it's going to take time and practice. It's going to take writing really bad poems to get to the good poems. Like, I've written a lot of terrible poetry that will never see the light of day. But without that practice, without just playing around with those different tools and with language and with form, I've written a lot of bad sonnets, y'all, but I had to just kind of like practice and see what I could do with it, and if it was for me, or what about writing a sonnet can I take with me into my free verse poems or whatnot, right? So don't be afraid to fail and to fall and to just like suck at it for a while, right? Because there are still gems. You're still growing and learning, and kind of you need that practice, I think. So find the kind of poetry that speaks to you, and then go from there, and just write.
And I think I can speak for all of us. When you look at our books, there were a lot of poems that did not make it into that final book. Like for every poem that did get the okay from an editor, there were poems that definitely got cut or like rewritten. So I think sometimes it's hard because you're comparing your draft of a writing to someone's ultra polished work that's sitting on a shelf, and we forget, and I forget even every time I sit down to write a new book. I'm like, oh, why is this so terrible? But it's because I'm comparing it to the book that I just put out, that's in its final stage, or as final as we could get it. So I think that's a good reminder to have to, like, remember you're comparing your drafts to someone else's finished product.
Absolutely. I think too, something interesting, and this has happened twice now. It happened once this past weekend in New York when we were at the Latinx Storytellers Conference. And then it happened again, like maybe earlier. It would happen before, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when I was teaching a master class in Minneapolis. And I had 2 writers that had never written a poem before, ever. And I didn't know that when they came into my class. And had them, and the prompt was to write a poem, because I promise people when they come to a lot of my classes is that you will leave a poet, whether or not you started, like whether or not you wanted to or knew you were. By the end of today, you will be a poet because you have written a poem. And both of them wrote these beautiful poems that perhaps they thought weren't so hot, but I thought they were brilliant. And also, the interesting thing is that they both followed this very natural poetic structure, which is kind of shaped like a wave or like a pig's tail, like where there's like some kind of attention and noticing, and then there's some sort of realization, right? And for both of them, they both did that naturally, which speaks to how poetry is within us, even when we don't think it is, or when we don't know how or why or where. It's in us. And so I think if you feel like, oh, this poem sucks or whatever, you might be surprised, because if you showed it to another poet, they would be like, well, actually, this is what you're doing, or this is what you're up to, or you're following this natural shape already. Like, look at you go. You already have it within you. So I think thinking about that too is really trusting that there's something, if that everybody can be a poet. We all need to work on that muscle of paying attention and thinking deeply. And that's really what poetry is at its basic kind of essence, I think. So if you're doing that, that's already a beautiful step. And my guess is that it's not as I don't know. I bet it's working in more ways than you think. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we probably have time for one more audience question. How do you get over writer's block? I know. I feel like sometimes writers get these questions, and I always feel bad because I feel like I never have a good answer.
That's what I do, because I have a lot of I taught workshops on this, and I've taken a lot of time to really think about it and to create a recipe for it, if you will, for myself. And so what I share with others, because I'm very also big on alliteration, is it's not that I don't believe in writer's block. I think at times either one of two things is happening. Usually it's just you're tired and you're burnt out, right? So like thinking about what is it that you need to like move past it in some way. So for me, it's either rest. I need to either rest and just take a break. I need to read, because reading always inspires me. I need to write something else, right? Like just get away from the thing that I think it is that I want to be working on, and just play around with something else, whatever that looks like. And or I need to engage in some other creative outlet, right? Whether that's like indie films, a museum, a dance, a concert, theater, whatever that looks like, to kind of reinvigorate those creative juices for me. What helps me like not have writer's block on the regular is that I have a very specific set of rituals and routines that I engage in that prepares me for the writing process. So much like if you have a routine before you go to bed that signals to your brain and to your body, it's time to go to sleep now. This idea of like sort of muscle memory, it's the same thing for my writing process. So I have a set of rituals that I engage in anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes before I even put a single word on the page, that I got into the habit during my MFA program, because I had to submit 20 pages of work every single month. I couldn't not do it. I had to, or 10 poems a month. And so I created these rituals, pre-writing rituals that basically sparked my brain to say, oh, now we're about to get creative. Oh, now we have to get into this work, into this writing. And so that has helped me to not necessarily have to fight so hard against writer's block necessarily. It doesn't always work, but a lot of the times it really does. But if I'm really feeling stuck for days and days or weeks at a time, it's like, okay, I'm forcing this. And unless I'm like under deadline, like I just stop forcing it. I'm like, I need to rest. I need to read. I need to engage in some other creative exercise to like get away from this and then come back. Mm-hmm. That's my best answer.
I definitely agree with the reading one, that reading other middle grades has gotten me out of writer's block multiple times. I remember when I was writing Something Like Home, that was the first book I ever wrote on deadline, because I sold both of my books at the same time. And so I had to write Something Like Home on deadline, which I had never done before. And I was getting stuck and unfortunately did not have the opportunity to just push it aside and work on something else. And honestly, this book has nothing to do with Something Like Home, but I remember In the Key of Us by Mariama J. Lockington completely got me out of the worst writer's block I had during that book, even though it's not really like, it's not even related at all to the reasons I was blocked. But sometimes just reading good writing will make you be like, oh my gosh, I want to write like her. So, and I've met her, I've told her, she knows I like fangirl over her all the time. But finding those writers that like you always think their books are good to have, to be able to pull from your shelf is very helpful.
He's the sweetest. I love that. Oh, I'm just gonna agree with this on head nod. Like I feel like, and for myself, my own routine, I think, is getting to a coffee shop. When I sold Saints, I got like the pink computer, which I'm looking at right now. I got the things, like the author thing. I'm in my office-y area, right? But I found that, actually what I needed to do was get my butt to a coffee shop with my crappy laptop, that whenever I open it, the 3 keys pop off, which I'm not even exaggerating. Like, that's not me being fictitious. I'm being completely honest. Like, the one that I have to plug in half the time, this is probably a hazard. Don't tell my editor this. That's like my computer. But that's what I have to do. I have to get myself. I thought that maybe this, being on a computer in my office would be the thing. Nope, it's going to a coffee shop and getting away. and writing like I did when I was a teenager. And so that's something that's like part of my own muscle and routine. And so I think that, yeah, again, like those routines are really, really helpful sometimes, I think, to also trigger in your mind to know what you need to do. Mm-hmm. So echoing.
I love this. And I'm going to remember your alliteration, Jasmine. I like that.
I wrote it down.
Remember you're getting, honestly, I love following other authors on social media, or authors specifically who talk about their writing process for that same reason. So if you are someone who is looking for tips and tricks, like follow the authors that you really enjoy, because like I know with Jasminne, for example, like she's always posting like revision pictures and stuff, and her method is completely different from mine, but I'm always like starstruck and awestruck, and it inspires me to like do revision in different ways. So I think, just in this conversation, I think we've all, inspired each other in different ways, which is always nice. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I feel like I could talk with the two of you forever. This was a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we got to sit down together. Thank you to everyone who attended the Poetry in Motion panel here at the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival, whether live or in the future. Remember, this lives on our YouTube channel forever. And I hope that you are all able to catch some more of our wonderful programming in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hola, amigos. Hello, friends. I'm Tiffany Schofield, Senior Acquisitions Editor for Thorndike Press Youth Large Print. And all of us here at Thorndike are excited to be supporting this year's virtual Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. Introduce your students to our research-based reading intervention solution of Youth Large Print. Our format increases reading engagement and stamina. Your learners will build confidence in literacy, improve their reading skills, and develop a healthier mindset about reading. 47% of students experienced less anxiety and stress about reading. We are so excited that Large Print empowers all students to be reintroduced to the fun and love of reading and learning. With a larger font size, 1/3 more line spacing, and less text per page, Thorndike's English and Spanish youth large print books are easier to read and less intimidating for developing readers. Our editions are completely unabridged, feature the original artwork, and published in a durable hardcover format backed by our 100% satisfaction guarantee. Our Spanish language youth large print collection includes high interest, relatable, and engaging stories for today's middle grade and young adult readers, and are also available in English language youth large print. Thorndike Press's youth large print format supports the journey of transforming literacy. With our accessible format, we're not just supporting education and literacy, we're igniting a lifelong love of learning and empowering a new generation to soar beyond their dreams. Watch for our LKBF24 free book giveaways of Spanish and English youth large print books. If you're not one of the lucky schools drawn, you can still take advantage of our limited time book festival discount with promo code LatinxKL24. View all our available titles by visiting gale.com/Thorndike/Latinx Follow Thorndike Press on social media to stay informed on new literacy research. More statistics coming very soon. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us by visiting gale.com/Thorndike/Latinx Team up with Thorndike Press Youth Large Print, and together, let's reshape the future of literacy one page at a time. See you at the festival.